Okay, welcome everyone to our presentation session today from AI New Jersey, entitled Across the Pond, a Candid Conversation on Small Firm Practice Between the UK and the US. Speakers are listed here on the title page, but just so you know who's speaking now, my name is William J. Martin. My friends call me Bill, so everyone should refer to me as Bill. We are going to try to get to a nice, robust Q&A at the end of the session, which if you were tuned into the previous session, we had a bit of an issue. We ran out of time. So today's speakers are Scott Masker from the UK. He'll be my co-moderator. Myself, you already know. Then we have Kimberly Bunn, who is on the US side from New Jersey, down by Moorestown, which is suburban Philadelphia. Next, Marissa Iamello, who has a small practice in the central New Jersey area, New Jersey Shore area. And then Laura Locke from the UK, and we're going to introduce our UK guests with their bios also. And then Alex Giles is also a small practitioner from the UK. So. All right, here is our CEO approval. We were approved by the American Institute of Architects for 1.5 learning units. The course is registered with AIICES for continuing professional education, and as such, does not include content that could be deemed or construed as an approval or an endorsement by the organization. Moving on, our course description. Across the Pond, a candid conversation on small firm business practice. We are going to try to keep this conversational. We don't want it to be dry and boring. So we're all going to be talking at some point, and we may talk over each other once in a while, but we're going to try to maintain a civilized panel environment here. But we're talking about, the process of dealing with small firm practice and the differences between the United Kingdom and the United States. And like I said, we're going to do this in a conversational way. The course here, our session today, is best suited for small and mid-sized firm principals and project managers, and also others. The topics that we're going to cover are business practices and practice management, essentially. Now, here are our learning objectives. I'm not going to read the slide, but for all of our continuing ed, we have to have learning objectives. And here we have 4 learning objectives. One is safety, the second one is welfare, the third is health. And then the last one describes the, what we're doing today is the commonalities and contrasts between practice in the US, in North America, and in Europe, in the UK. And that's how our learning objectives have laid out. Legal compliance, the AIA and its members are committed to the highest ethical standards and full compliance with all laws, regulations, including federal and state antitrust laws in the US. We are going to be following the letter and spirit of those laws to protect the integrity of our professions and the reputation of the American Institute of Architects. All right, Scott, why don't you introduce yourself and the 2 UK participants in our panel?
Okay, very good. So I'm Scott Masker. I was the sole practitioner for a little while in the beginning of 2021, but very soon the practice has been able to grow. And although I am a New Jersey native originally, I moved over to England in 1989, and I've been practicing here, and one of the main reasons for coming over here was to work on historic buildings. I was a director at a multidisciplinary practice for about 20 years prior to doing what I'm doing now. Moving on, my UK colleagues. Is that how we're going to do it, Bill? Do you want to?
Yeah, let's do it that way.
Yeah, we'll do it that way. Laura Locke, who works for a couple. She previously worked for a fairly high-profile design-led practice doing high-end residential work, and now in her current position works for another similar practice, still in town here in Winchester, England. and we've known each other for quite a while through other kind of collegiate things that go on at the RIBA here in our local area. Similarly, Alex Giles is an architect who runs two companies. One that deals with, as I understand it, and Alex, you can clarify this later, does quite a bit of work in London, and then again, he works on high-end residential work here in the Winchester, Hampshire area, as well as elsewhere. And obviously, their expanded biographies are there for you to see as you need to.
Okay, I will take it from this side of the ocean. Back up a bit. Okay. As I introduced myself earlier, this is my bio. I'm not going to read it, but for the most part, I was educated at Carnegie Mellon University and Pratt Institute in New York City. I run a small practice, which I have done for the last 30 years. I used to work on larger buildings. I used to do hospitals and large-scale warehouse distribution facilities, just about every building type. And I used to have employees working for me. I no longer have that. I focus now mainly on smaller projects. I find that the craft of architecture and my interest in the craft of architecture has led me to become very detail-oriented in my projects. So I'm doing a lot of I would call it moderate level residential. I do a lot of addition renovation work. I save a lot of old buildings from demolition and rehab them and make them sustainable and make them energy efficient. That is the gist of my practice these days. And I'm going to move now to Kimberly Bunn. Kimberly, her bio is up on the PowerPoint right now. And Kim is the principal of Bunn Architecture. And you can see her education there as well. And Kim does a lot of projects that involve historic preservation. She's also very active in our AI New Jersey organization. She's a past president of AI New Jersey. She's also very active in her community and has co-authored a book about local town history and spreads the word on the value of architecture whenever she can. And now we have Marissa Iamello. And Marissa is the primary co-owner of Iamello Architectural Studio. She mentioned her dad, who is a well-respected architect in the state of New Jersey and in AI New Jersey, is her partner. Marissa and Kim were both part of our last presentation, but Marissa does a lot of high-end residential type work, and she's also done commercial work as well. And she does a lot of sustainable design. We're all working towards our practices, leaning towards sustainable design to make sure that we can address the issues of climate change. And you see her bios up there. And I will leave this up for a moment so it's captured in our recording. And I think, Scott, that concludes the PowerPoint. I'm going to turn it off and we can move on with our panel discussion, just with the 6 of us. And we should follow the outline if you want to start, Scott, with the first topic, and then we'll see how the panel works. Great.
So again, one of the things that attracted Bill and I to create this this kind of discussion was this idea about, you know, architectural approach and how we found things can be quite similar, you know, in the States and here in the UK. So what we want to do now is start out with a bit of an idea about the general business context and look at how we work and kind of do things in a general manner. And then, as you can see from the agenda, we will work into more detailed, much more detailed areas of how you know we work as architectural practices. So, you know, we talk about where does architecture start. And I think the one thing that strikes me as being very interesting is that we kind of have to make our own opportunities these days, and think architects are generally fairly entrepreneurial, but one really has to get beyond the sitting in your studio and waiting for the work to arrive at your doorstep. So with that initial thought, it would be good to hear from our panel about how you look at getting work and kind of achieving that contact and appointments with your colleagues.
I'm still waiting for the work to arrive, but in the meantime, I managed to stay busy. I was thinking maybe we would start with each panelist could describe what their current setup is. If they want to give a little history as to how they got there, that would be helpful. Why don't we start with Laura?
Laura, you're on mute, Laura.
That's technical difficulty. Sorry. So I've been with Adam Nib for 2 years now. As Scott said, I was formerly with another practice nearby that's very similar in its setup, but obviously there's subtle differences between both practices, which is quite interesting. But I bring to it as well my own experience. But fundamentally, I think a network is important, but we don't benefit from repeat work doing private residential projects. And I think that's the biggest challenge in the sector that we're in. And both practices are probably similar in their marketing in that they rely on competition and awards and publications from that, that then gets articles and things online. And so both practices, I think it's fair, and particularly Adam Nib Architects has quite a high search rate on Google, and Google gets us quite a lot of our hits. And if I'm honest, I think that's where most of our traffic comes. We have high Instagram followers, and we try and post on there regularly, which again tracks through Google and things. But ultimately, really, it's search engines and phone calls to us, and a small amount of recommendations locally within Winchester. But the wider field, certainly, I think we just come up on Google quite well.
Okay, let's see how everyone else is set up. Kim, let's go to you.
Yeah, interestingly, I'm a sole proprietor, so I'm small. I do primarily residential, but small commercial. And it's interesting because as opposed to Laura, I get most of my work from referrals. I get from past clients, I get from contractors, from building officials. And then, with the different networks in town, I get referrals through that, past clients, other people say, oh, my neighbors use this person. My work is primarily within 2 hours of where I live. So again, that network is there. And I will say I do get cold calls that come from the internet and stuff like that. But I probably only normally do about 5% of those projects when I get a cold call. It really is referral and word of mouth and other networks. And I'm very involved in my local community, so that probably also helps, again, that network. But it's a different network, and that referral then comes more highly ranked. So when they call me, they feel like they already know me and have a comfort level.
Very good. Alex, how about you?
So as Scott sort of suggested, our setup is slightly different to the standard small practice setup you might expect, and that's come about because 5 years ago I set up on my own. I started out as a sole trader here in Winchester as a very small practice. After a year, that became 2 of us. And at the same time, an ex-colleague of mine who I'd worked with in London set up on his own, almost exactly the same time, set up in London. We were doing a lot of sort of collaborative work together over the course of the first 2 years. And then it kind of came to the point after a couple of years where we were doing so much collaborative work that we decided to merge our 2 small practices into one company. And then we had 2 brands. So we had a sort of residential domestic brand down in Winchester, and we had a more commercial minded brand that did larger developments up in London. Now we've kept those 2 brands because we see them as very separate sort of entities, and they attract different client bases, and the way that we get work is very different. So in the similar way to the way Laura's described, the residential domestic staff is much more on recommendations and a bit of Google advertising, and they are there's not really repeat work through that. It's more one-off projects. But for the more commercial development stuff that we do in more urban environments, mostly in London, it's very much about relationships and networks and repeat work through developers. We don't really have much of a sort of online presence. That's very much about sort of business development and pushing these networks with more commercial clients. So I'm seeing kind of both sides of the work winning situations there. So it's quite interesting.
That's terrific. That's a great origin story. All right, Marissa, you're up.
So I would say a lot of my work is word of mouth and referrals. We've only really kind of had our company just working, the two of us, for 5 years. Before that, we had our company, but both my father and I were working for other people. So when we first started out, it was word of mouth. Now we have a pretty close relationship with some local contractors in the area. So I get a lot of referrals from contractors, because a lot of times for residential, people will go to the contractor first, which is not how it should be. But they will recommend us. And then past clients will refer us out to other people. We have, of course, Instagram and Facebook. We have our website. There's a way to contact us directly through the website. So people do reach out to us through the website or cold call. But I would say like the majority of our work is probably referrals.
Okay. I'm going to take it now for my work comes from about it comes in 3 different ways. I get about 1/3 of my work from referrals. I get about 1/3 of my work that from internet searches that people find me based on my qualifications as an architect and a community planner to help them with the regulatory process. And I get about 1/3 of my work from my activity on social media and in my presence online.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty much where the work comes from on my end. It's definitely, the internet has definitely made it much easier for small practices to have a footprint, at least in my opinion. I don't know, Scott, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's important to kind of, I think one thing, once you start getting a reputation in an area, to advertise locally. I mean, although it's not normally a good way of getting work, but once you're known in a certain area, and they have so here there's a big tradition of having village brochures and things that circulate in your local town or village, and you can put an ad in there, and then it's a combination of word of mouth then and them seeing you present in the community. But the other way, I think, again, this point about entrepreneurship is really important. And I've had a number of circumstances where I've introduced opportunities to both developers and individuals where they've turned into significant or multiple job opportunities that have spun out to be quite meaningful for the business. So and that's where I think one place where the architect should concentrate more, looking at those opportunities, even finding sites for our clients where we can be sure we can put pretty definitive opportunities before individuals and developers, and then you can move forward with them in that. And I think that's one thing that we're certainly not necessarily trained for, but it's something that, along with just running your business, that we're not really trained for, as we're trained in concentrating on design mostly. So I think those are things that kind of where we can find those missed opportunities, and it reduces the struggle quite significantly in terms of getting and doing work.
So why don't you segue right into fees now? What do you think is the best way in your practice to charge? Not the amounts, but is it hourly? Is it percentage? It's flat? How do you do that?
So I was thinking about this quite, because it's a funny one, but it varies depending on who if it's a regular client and they're known and trusted, you deal with it one way. If it's somebody new and you might have some doubts about perhaps how they're going to react to your proposal for services, you might look to ask for some money up front just to set the scene. I think that's just good practice. It's smart business. And to be honest, I think there's an issue about being too cheap. That means definitely, you can, if you're seen as being naive or lacking a certain acumen, I think your client would actually appreciate a sharper approach to not only the business, and which may then reflect on how an introduction as to how you're going to actually do the work in an efficient, kind of professional way. So I wouldn't ever be shy of asking for retainers or deposits, because that's just good practice. And of course, if they don't want to engage in that way, then you probably know you've dodged a bullet in terms of perhaps a bad payer or a difficult client.
You're singing my song. What do you think, Marissa?
There we go.
I would
Agreeing
agree.
again. How
I would agree. I always ask for a retainer. Even if it's a smaller project, it's just a small percentage of the overall fee, just to get the project started off. The way I usually structure my fees, like Scott said, it kind of varies by client, but for the most part, I'll do schematic design as an hourly rate, because with residential, some people can really drag their feet or take a very long time to make decisions, or maybe they'll have one design and completely scrap it and start over. So in order to not, kind of like screw myself over, I do an hourly rate during schematic design. But usually for construction documents, I know when the project is starting, pretty much what kind of details are going to be involved. So that's usually a flat rate. And I usually base that off of an overall percentage of the construction cost. So like if it's new construction, I might ask a contractor, if this is a new build, what would you generally say as a cost per square foot? And I will base my fee as a percentage of that. For renovation work, kind of similar. If I get a sense that someone is going to be a particularly aggravating client, I might tack on a percentage to my fee, knowing that they are going to be particularly aggravating ahead of time. But the other thing I did want to say about fees is not only do I ask for a retainer upfront, I do not release my final drawings until I've received final payment.
Yeah, that's a smart thing to do. Okay, what happens with that in the UK, Alex? What's your favorite way to charge?
That's an open-ended question, isn't it? I think it's best suited to, I take a judgment on who I'm working for and use my sort of experience to tailor a fee structure to what I think that they're going to see value in. Generally on the sort of domestic side, private clients, I think that they prefer to understand what a kind of fixed fee looks like for a project, rather than just opening up a kind of open book. Is an endless amount of work, and they want to know how much they're going to be paying for a service, and they want to have the stages of the project very clearly outlined from the word go, really. I find that to be more successful than just saying, perhaps here's an hourly rate and how long's a piece of string. But for the more the commercial side of things, the developers, it's always a percentage of construction costs. So we'll take the build cost and we'll tailor a percentage of that for our professional services. And obviously that percentage tends to decrease the larger the project. So we'll take a sort of a view on what percentage that is, and tailor it to be competitive, but also not to be cheap. I think Scott's point about you provide a quality service, and that shouldn't be undermined by the level of fee that you go in with. And I don't know if the same is true in the States, but I think our industry here is a little bit in danger of there are a lot of people that are trading at getting away with the kind of minimum service and doing it for quite a cheap price, and that tends to potentially bring down the value in what our architects offer as a service. I think as a profession we should avoid that. You know, we're quite keen to be paid appropriately for the level of service that we provide, and we're honest about that to our clients as well.
Very good. Kim, what's your favorite way?
I think what might, Bill, be useful to explain to everybody is the difference between, in a sense, being an architect in the States and being an architect in England. So in England, the title, in the UK, the title is protected. In other words, you don't need an architect to design or be involved in the construction process. We don't sign our drawings off in the same way you guys do, where you have protection of function in the state. So it makes it a little bit different. So as Alex was saying, the value that any client puts on you is up to you to broadcast to them, to communicate to them. So it's quite different. Whereas you guys at least have, I guess, a minimum standard. So you know you have to perform to a certain level as an architect, and there's a value level there. Whereas again, here we have a lot of architectural technologists and other people providing a service to design buildings. Whether those designs are any better or not is another question, of course.
Yeah, we have some of that here. But we're in New Jersey. It's one of the most heavily regulated states of the US. So there's lots of rules that follow, and the clients have to follow rules when they design buildings in order to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. But Kim, what's your favorite way to get money from people?
Paying clients are good.
Yes.
I actually do, especially with the residential, I do work on a fixed fee. I find that, especially in that area, clients really are confused about the process. Many, when you start with them, haven't worked with an architect before. They don't know exactly what to anticipate. So, from previous experience and hearing other stories, billing hourly normally wasn't the way that seemed to work well on projects. You found clients would be hesitant to call you and talk to the architect because they didn't want to get another bill, or they'd rush in the schematic design process of making decisions to have it be faster. And then that would be more changes later down the line. So I've always structured on a fixed fee, very upfront. We have a very in-depth initial meeting before I come back with what that fee is going to be, and it's gauged project by project. And in that meeting, I mean, you get used to dealing with clients, and you get a feel in that meeting, are they going to take a while to make decisions? Are they going to be one, like Marissa said, going back and forth and being indecisive? Or are they going to be quicker? So you kind of make a judgment call from that meeting and then propose, what the fee is going to be and how it breaks up. I definitely take a retainer to start the job. That actually works as the payment for the schematic design phase. And so again, they see what that value is there when we get into the process. But I'm also very clear that there potentially can be additional fees and change orders that will be approved. If they do decide to make a major change in the process, we talk about, okay, because of that, this is going to require more work. And then what will that fee be? There's always an approval process for any fee rather than surprising them with a bill.
Okay. Laura, what's your favorite way to collect fees in the UK?
Well, interestingly, we do it a bit differently from how the others have presented, which was also a little bit new to me as well, to a certain extent when we came here. But we do so Adam goes out and meets the clients, and we do a front-ended, which is quite front-ended risk for ours, but we do a feasibility report on a fixed fee, which is very low relative to the amount of output that we put in, which is potentially quite controversial in terms of managing the value of what we're adding to a project. I think that's where it can be controversial. But what I've learned certainly so far is the conversion is actually very high. So because the upfront kind of block of work that's being presented, it's easy for clients to sign up to that, and they feel genuinely that they can walk away from that at the end of it. But they don't seem to, interestingly, and that again depends a bit on the client and the assessment of the client from the outset. Obviously, one that we think is unrealistic about the construction budget and our fees is it has to be managed differently. And sometimes it's a case of presenting a budget of what our fixed fees might look like for our entire scope all the way through the service. Other times it looks like a great project. They're speaking to a couple of other architects. We want to get our foot in the door, so we would say, you know, for a couple of grand, we could do you a few options and do an analysis of the site, and you know, sit around the table and discuss it a bit further and develop your brief a bit more. So it tends to act as quite a good hook. It's, as I say, it's quite front-ended risk for us, but the conversion seems to be quite successful, and it certainly impressed me doing it that way, and it's been less risky than perhaps I perceived it when I joined the practice. So yeah, that's quite interesting. We do fixed fees as a general rule until what we call stage 5, which is construction on site, and that varies a bit again, and that tends to be up to what the clients sign up for. I think unfortunately in the UK, the general view of the public, of the lay client, is that our job's done, and then the builder, this great hero, turns up and delivers it, and they know far more about how to build things than we do, and so convincing clients that it's important that we're on site and that we do contract administration, but also that the design process continues and we're there to make sure they are building to the quality and to the detailing that we have drawn and that we are expecting and that they are expecting, because that's why they came to us in the first place. That's the hardest bit. It's so hard, and it's so hard to make money on that, because then there's projects we're invested in that we want photographs of at the end, which is a whole different subject, and how do you keep that relationship going. And it's like the monopoly of the client at the end of the project, whether or not you're going to get photographs of it. So yeah, it's quite complex, I guess, how you kind of get to the end and stay involved. And it really depends on the client and the project and the contractor often as well. There's contractors we really trust and they will deliver a good quality. There's others not so much. So yeah, that bit definitely varies more towards the end.
Yeah,
I've just I think it's interesting that that slightly different take, and it's about establishing goodwill with a client. So they give you a bit, you give them a bit, and then you see how you get on, and you don't really lose out necessarily. And you know that can be a very good way of progressing. The other thing that, from a very purely business perspective, is trying to agree monthly fee drawdowns, you know, regardless of whether you've finished a stage of work or not, because it just keeps the wheels oiled, doesn't it? You know, so if you can spread your fee, whether, you know, across a number of months, you could see the end. The client knows what every month, they know what they're getting into, and you don't have to struggle to get payment for a stage of work where you've already done the work, then you bill, and then you have to wait, you know, whatever, another month at least, depending on whether they pay their bill on time, to, you know, receive your just due for the work. Of course, in Marissa's case, holding back the information prior to getting paid, you know, is always a good move, you know. So
yeah,
we do that. Sorry, the hand holding.
No, I was going to say that you know, Laura, you mentioned that the builder's the hero. I've spent a career chipping away at that, and the people I work with see value, at least you know, they may not initially, but they see very quickly the value that I bring by being there, eyes and ears on the site during the construction. So the way I prefer a flat fee structure myself. I mean, I do have other structures depending on the size of the scope of the project and how many others I might potentially have to bring in. But the vast majority of what I do is a flat fee structure. And I have found that responds to the client's fear of risk. At least the clients that I have, at least here in where I am in the Northeast of the US, are very afraid of risk. Risk drives nearly every decision that they make. So what I try to do is, as they call me for a project, I find out, you know, what it is that they're trying to do. I try to get as much information as I can, including any documents that they've already acquired, such as surveys, or if they're working with site engineers, if they have any site engineering. And then what I will do is, based on that information, I go out and look at the site. This is all before I collect the fee. I invest a little of my own time in the relationship first. And then what I can do is, because I have a bit of a background in the economic side of design, I can give them a pretty good idea right up front what the construction is going to cost them. So I turn the conversation towards that, because in comparison to what the construction is going to cost them, the architectural fees are relatively small. So after I get them past, what they're going to need to invest in order to actualize and realize that project, that's when I explain to them what the flat fee will be, and I divide it up into payments. Payments are tied to milestones in the progress of my services. But one of the things that I do that I found that works very well for happy clients at the end of the project is, into my flat fee, I build in the site visits and the what we would call contract administration. I build that right into the flat fee. I do not bill them extra for that, because if I build them extra, they're not going to call me. And then what happens is they're out on site with some issue that's arisen. The contractor is blaming me. I'm not there. They don't want to bring me in because they don't want to have to pay the additional fee or whatever that I would charge. And things start to erode. And by the end of the project, even though you've done a perfectly executed project, they don't like you anymore because of all of the conversations they've had with the contractor that you don't know had occurred. So
this is a typical problem, isn't it? When the builder does, well, I know how to do this. This is the way I've always done it. I don't know why the architect's done it that way. Let's just do it this way. And then something else happens, knock-on effect of one decision, one bad decision after another. And then there you are.
That's right.
At the tail end of being blamed for everything, yet they've changed it.
Exactly. And that's why I build that into my fee. And at the end of the project, the clients are very happy. But I love those conversations where the contractor says, well, this is the way I always do it. And I was like, well, you can't do it that way, because that doesn't comply with code. The new upgrades in the energy requirements, the mechanical systems now have to be much higher efficiency. And I see you put in SEER 14 equipment when SEER 18 was in the project specs. So now we're going to have to remove what you did, and we're going to have to put in what we were supposed to put in, because your contract says you're going to follow the drawings. So when the clients hear those conversations, they suddenly realize the value, very serious value that you're bringing to the project, because you're helping them to get what they are paying for. You're also helping them to achieve all of their goals for the project. And in the end, that's really what they want. They want you to assist them in achieving all of their goals. So that's how I approach fees. I also will not start a project without a retainer. And my retainers are usually 1/3 of the fee. So the retainers are usually fairly sizable, but I haven't had any problems collecting on my fees. And I very, very rarely have fee disputes because I'm so involved in what's going on. But all right, Scott, where are we in the outline? What's next?
Where are we? Well, we kind of jumped from business practices to kind of appointments and retainers and deposits. But what we haven't talked about particularly are kind of contracts themselves. So once we get in the door, how do you form your agreement with your new client? And interestingly, I was kind of looking at this a bit before our talk, and the RIBA has a number of standard documents that you can use. So for a domestic client, you could present them with a 36-page RIBA published contract between you as the practitioner and your client. Now, I would never do that, because first of all, they get very confused. And I've had any number of clients approach me, new clients, who have said, well, this other architect has started talking me through all these stages, and my eyes just glassed over, and I quickly dismissed using him, and I need somebody to please talk plainly to us and give us a sensible, for our relatively modest project, give us a sensible proposal and approach for this kind of thing. So you got to be careful. Everything you need to have your appropriate due diligence and all that, but really, at the end of the day, the client's saying, I want to do X, Y, and Z. You're saying, in order to do that, I will give you A, B, and C as a service. And that's your agreement at the end of the day. I mean, it's pretty simple. And then you have your professional codes of conduct under which you perform anyway. So, you know, your performance is evaluated and protected in that way. Their interests are protected by virtue of you being an architect. And so everything should be fine without long-winded legal agreements and solicitors being involved and all that kind of thing. Obviously, for much larger projects, it's a slightly different story when you're dealing with big entities, but mainly for us here, you know, small, medium-sized practices, it's probably the mantra should be to keep it simple.
Okay, all right, form of contract, people. Kim, what do you do?
I do have a standard contract. It's not an AIA one because the same thing you said about the RIBA ones being very long and confusing. I found the same thing with the AA contracts, unfortunately. Now, I did read them, take some of the language here and there, and I also retained a lawyer when I started my firm and helped review the contract and set it up. But it's only 3, maybe 4 pages. So much easier for clients to relate to.
Yeah, no, I'm the same way. How about you, Alex?
We have a one side of A4 terms of engagement, which highlights all of our sort of terms, payment terms, and then it covers anything that is an obligation under our title. So like writing to the client and informing them of their obligations under any specific regulations. All of that's covered in our first sort of terms of engagement sheet. And we've accompanying with that, we'll do our fee proposal, which breaks down the project stages and the sort of deliverables in those project stages, and then the fixed fee for that. And so those sort of 2 documents form our appointment. And then if we get a written instruction by email, that's sufficient to warrant our sort of terms of engagement with them. Keeping it simple is the key thing, really.
That sounds like a great idea. You're breaking a complex, what is a complex document that you're trying to keep simple into 2 separate documents that they get them both. I do something very similar, but I'm interested in hearing what else happens in the UK.
Well,
Laura,
I think this idea of a standard terms and conditions is pretty de rigueur here. So, but then those standard terms and conditions vary in length from practice to practice. Again, as Kim said, depending on what advice you got originally when you set up your practice and your mechanisms for doing business. So, and depending on what advice you get from this solicitor or that one, or whether you've taken it from your professional organization. So,
Laura, how about you?
And they change with as regulations change. They need to be updated constantly to sort of be compliant with the current state of the market.
Absolutely. Laura, what's your favorite form of contract?
So this is hot topic for us actually at the moment, because we have just started using the RIBA domestic contract. But I mean, literally just, I mean, we reviewed it in January and drafted everything up, and we've just, so the strategy that we're currently taking is that, as I said before, we do this initial fixed fee for the feasibility. And we might give them a draft of what our fees look like. So similar to Alex and probably everybody, we have a letter and we have a fee that goes with it that breaks down into the stages, and it's a tick box of what services are included and what's essentially not, so that if it's a client that wants something quite stripped back, we can reduce our fee accordingly. So it's a really clear kind of tick box set of deliverables. And that would probably be a draft at that stage. And then we have a A4 sheet of terms and conditions, and that will be the appointment for that first stage. That we just didn't feel like the RIBA document is relevant when you're just signing up for a couple of £1,000s worth of fee. And so that goes out on now. We started using DocuSign, which means that it is really just an email electronic transaction, and we're finding that is so much better, and we are getting clients return on that really, really fast now. It's almost within minutes we'll have it back from them signed. Then when we do the full service, that's when we're introducing the RIBA document, the RIBA contract. And we are navigating our way how best to do that, because you have to buy it each time, and it's a heck of a document to fill in, and you don't want to do that if they're not going to sign up to the fees. And there's also a covering page in it right at the front, which you have to tick to say that you've advised the client on all sorts of requirements, which honestly you don't really do until they've at least given you a fee to advise them. Right. So it's a bit difficult to get over that hurdle of ticking that front page when they haven't appointed you yet. So we are drafting a document that we will send with it, which is more like going to be a brochure essentially of Adam Nib Architects, and glossy images about why you want to appoint Adam Nib Architects and how we work and who we are. But in it, it's going to have a bit of basic CDM regulations. So you might need a party wall surveyor, and you might need this, and you might need that to tick, essentially cover that tick box that the form requires. So a few layers to it, I suppose, that will be issued to them at varying times in a kind of couple of month engagement until we get to the full document.
Yeah. Marissa, how come a handshake isn't any good anymore?
That doesn't work. Usually what I'll do is I'll put together a proposal that outlines very clearly the project understanding, which is that initial meeting that we sat down and discussed what the scope of their project would be. And even if it's for a smaller project, I still, put together a pretty extensive proposal outlining my scope of services, from zoning analysis, if there's any variances needed, what that process is like, coming back to do as-built, schematic design, and the construction document phase. And then I also have in there, what fees aren't included, like, anything that's out of my wheelhouse, like soil boring or, surveying. All those things need to be dealt with by an outside consultant. So all those things are outlined in my proposal as well. And then of course the fee structure is outlined in there as well. And usually what I do is I say at the end of my proposal is that once this is signed, I'll follow it up with a standard AIA contract. Because again, I'm not going to go through and do the whole AIA contract if they haven't gone through with the project. So that's pretty much how I structure mine.
So interestingly, from Marissa and Laura, from both of your points of view, adopting the standard form of contract, is that because you want more surety and protection moving forward when you get to the more complicated areas of the work? Or is it because it's just professional due diligence? Is it to try to deal with professional indemnity better? What would be the main reason for moving to the more kind of complex agreement?
I would say for a larger scale project, it kind of just gives me a little bit more of an assurance, following up with an AI contract. If it's something small, I probably won't be doing an AI contract for it. But if it's like a larger new build or something that's particularly complex, just to kind of add that layer of assurance to protect myself.
How about you, Laura?
Yeah, I'd say the same actually. It was a big discussion over the scale of projects that we had and the value of projects that we were having, and whether or not our previous setup was still appropriate. We also have had quite a few people doing their Part 3 exams, the professional exams in the office recently, so they'd all sort of taken our appointment and pulled it to pieces, as you do when you do your professional exams over here. So that was useful input and a bit of a learning curve, and it's keeping up with all the new regulations and things that are coming in constantly, and it's very easy to just accidentally have something that's contradicting yourself without realizing it, even though you know, and staying on top of that and the due diligence of making sure all of those are really up to date. The RIBA contract gives us that kind of assurance in that sense, although they haven't got the new building regs stuff through yet. But
yeah. So on that point, just for the US audience, two issues there. One is, in the UK, the architect is initially it takes the responsibility for health and safety issues relative to design when the work is actually on site, and then post design issues. So when you design a building, you need to think about safety right the way through the process. And there's actually a specific role called the principal designer, where you're obliged to deal with health and safety and monitor, maintain a file to inform the client when the project's complete that all these things have been done and these are the things that have been dealt with during construction, have been dealt with post-construction. And that the architect doesn't have to do that right the way through, but normally that is now our role. It has nothing to do with design. It's just about due diligence, health and safety. Is that worker going to fall off a scaffolding because you've designed something so unbelievably, acrobatic that it was dangerous to build, or later on when the client has to clean their windows, again, is that construction of a nature that makes it impossible or, stupid for somebody to clean the windows, or is there a special mechanism one needs to do that? It's that kind of thing and there's a separate appointment for that now as well. It's a completely separate RIBA appointment for principal designer. And then Laura mentioned the building regs, so that they're changing very quickly here now. So from 2021, there was new legislation that said, I think we had to increase the efficiency of buildings by 30% from that point. And in 2025, there's going to be further legislation kicking in for carbon neutral issues and to increase again the energy efficiency of buildings. So there's quite a few things going on here that these appointments don't reflect, and are normally that we're catching up with the appointments to do that kind of thing. So
What about inspectors? What about building permits and inspections? How is that handled in the UK?
So we have
changing.
yeah, that's another whole big topic. So we have the local authorities, like in the States, have building inspectors that you call out at certain points in the construction process. However, you can employ private companies now to do the same things and sign the work off and then tell the local authority that it's been built to standard. So it's hit and miss from local authority to local authority, how rigorous they want to be. I don't know, Laura or Alex, do you guys have anything to kind of add to that as a generality regarding how?
Well, I think it's worth noting that role of building inspector is rapidly changing, and they're putting much more responsibility back onto the architect, and they're creating this new position of building regulations principal designer, which is sort of, we as the professional team that have designed the building have got to take responsibility for confirming it's in accordance with building regulations. So that the responsibility of the building inspector is being diminished somewhat, and it's being brought right back onto the architect. And this is a very recent change that's happening. And in reality, the industry is still kind of adapting to it.
And how that actually pans out in practice, we don't yet know, because it's a new role that essentially we have to do. It's not really a kind of sign in or sign out. And then there's a letter of declaration at the end of the project, which it depends on which inspector you speak to as to exactly what that looks like. But yeah, so it's being unpacked, let's say, at the moment. It's quite interesting. I mean, the reading that I've done on it and the research that I've done on it, I think we already do that. I think that we already, as architects, our codes of conduct have always meant that we have to act with a duty of care and in compliance with regulations. I think the biggest shift is, without going off on too much of a tangent, is the building inspectors have not had a governing body. It transpires for quite some time, and they're now resurrecting that, and they're now having to all do exams, interviews and exams to re-qualify, essentially, to do, or at least to stay in their role, where they're currently going through that process at the moment, and they're not just allowed to inspect any building. It's now being divided up into sectors. So they're particularly relating to fire. So depending on how high the building is, they'll be restricted as to what types of buildings they can inspect. So that it's quite interesting just seeing how they're dealing with that separately, but also trying to inform us at the same time, and the ARB and RIBA trying to catch up with it and advise us on what we're supposed to be doing at the same time.
That's
In other words,
fascinating.
it's very hit and miss here in the sense that, so it's just localities, counties and districts that are handling it their own ways. And it's not really consistent across the country.
Yeah.
That's fascinating, but it seems to me, my initial reaction is that there's a lot to keep the barristers busy.
Yes.
If you're not careful, for sure.
Right. So, I mean, it sounds like a lot of liability.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
just on that, Bill, actually, and we thought that this change would have potential implications on our professional indemnity insurance. You know, the responsibility being put right back onto the architect. But actually, what we've discovered is most PI insurers are saying that as architects we should be doing this anyway. So it's not
Yeah.
actually having an implication on our insurances at all, and it's just confirming what our role should be and that we should be doing these processes anyway. So
What we're
yeah,
already doing. I think that's my conclusion of it as well currently, although we haven't had to sign a letter of declaration yet, which confirms that the building complies with building regulations. So.
no, we got one coming.
There are
Yeah.
some discussions about this kind of thing. The government tends to go back and forth. They have a building department, they fund it, and then they say, well, it's costing us too much, so now we're going to reduce it. We're going to push more responsibility back onto the professionals. And then a few years later, say, well, the professionals have too much responsibility. We're going to pull it back because we need the power in government. Kim, you and I have been involved in the AIA for a while. We've seen this go back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
The latest I hear is that they're going to have self-certification. Have you heard anything about that?
I only heard the same rumors that you did. I don't have anything specific on it, but yes, that was interesting. And, you know, again, back and forth with the regulations. And again, especially here in New Jersey, because yes, we have national building codes, but then each of the local municipalities each runs their own way and follows kind of their own rules. Even though there's a national code, they interpret things different. So, you know, you're dealing with a local inspector in this town is going to read something different than an inspector in another town. And then, you know, the whole discussion of having self-regulation because they want to get rid of the inspectors from the town perspective is kind of scary.
Yeah, it is. Marissa, what are you seeing in your part of the state?
I would say, so I submit drawings to pretty much the same municipalities over and over again. And I know, like, if I'm submitting to Ocean Township, they're going to want to see this specific thing, this specific detail. And I know if I'm submitting to Neptune Township, they're going to want to see this specific detail. And I have a set of standard details that I have for all my projects. And if I forgot to submit it, you know, I'll get a letter, oh, you don't have this. So for different municipalities, I kind of have like specific sets of details that are starting to come together so that I know it will get more quickly through those municipalities.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, Scott, where do we go from here in our outline?
Well, we're kind of coming up to our hour, Bill, so I don't know how far we want to go. So I think one area that would probably be good to touch on is the historic building area and the kind of in terms of moving on to, you know, other kinds of regulations that we have to deal with.
Do you want to see if we have any questions from participants and then kind of go back and forth? What do you think?
If you'd like, yeah, if we want to start some questions, that might spark some other areas of discussion.
Right.
So let's do that. Yeah.
Megan, can we open the question Q&A stuff or whatever?
Sure, yeah, there's one question here. Bill, handshake deals are still legally binding in certain states in the US. However, it's generally in very specific circumstances. Unless it's your handshake, then it's golden.
Okay, that sounds like Jeremiah, who is a RIBA member, by the way. His practice is in Little Rock, Arkansas, but he is a member of RIBA. Okay, for our participants, and I know we don't have a lot of participants, but if there's any questions, You put them in the Q&A box, and Megan, if you could alert us when the question comes in and let us know what it is,
Sure.
that would be great. So Scott, why don't we move on with whichever top, pick something else off the outline.
Yeah, so I thought it was interesting, and this kind of touches on a couple of things we've discussed already in terms of appointments, size of appointments, and that kind of thing. So very regularly, for instance, I get inquiries and work to, for instance, just change the windows in a historic building. Now in England, we have a program of what they call listed buildings, which is, protects buildings from being changed without a significant amount of approval from local authority. So things like just putting energy efficient glazing in a building which has, I don't know, 100-year-old windows that are all rotten for good reason. They're single glazed, they're not forming. And what do? Now, it used to be you couldn't replace single glazing with double glazing. Now they're taking a very different view of that. But then you have to come up with the appropriate amount of detail just to literally change a window. And because that window is, by virtue of it being part of a listed building, it's protected. So they become quite big jobs, even though you're just designing a window, because of all the legislation you have to deal with. Not only the listed building officer from the local authority, but even things like, I've had one recently where we had to do an ecology survey because of the presence of bats. Now, bats in the UK are a protected species, and every time you touch a roof in any building, or you build near trees or near water sources, you have to consider the ecology and also the critters like bats, badgers, that kind of thing. So it becomes a very big project. So that's quite interesting, like the level of protection that we have here, regarding our listed building stock.
That's interesting. Kim, you do historic preservation work. Are you running into that at all? Windows?
Again, it's really town by town, municipality by municipality. If they have, some towns have a historic preservation ordinance that goes on top of the other building codes, and other towns don't. Some towns do say that you can change windows without permits, which is kind of sad, because if you are in a historic building, you don't necessarily just want them changed, because it normally means a contractor is going to put in a vinyl replacement window that's not appropriate. So it really comes down to what town and what regulations do they follow. If there is a historic preservation ordinance, then we normally have to go through a process of putting things together, getting samples, and going in front of a commission or committee to have that approved before it's done.
Okay. All right. We have a question. So I'm going to move to the question. We'll see who can answer this question. This is from Ruchi Dar. How do you handle the situation when a GC, general contractor, recommends you, but once the drawings are done, the client wants quotes from other general contractors to make a final decision on contractors? Isn't it against the code of conduct to just recommend any GC? How does that work in the UK? Laura, have you ever run into that?
Yeah, that is interesting. I think, so tendering just generally in the UK, or from my experience, is challenging. Getting builders that are interested in tendering competitively is harder, although becoming a bit more buoyant again now they're looking for work a bit more. It tends to follow how busy everybody is. But certainly through the back of COVID and what Brexit over here, prices rocketed like exponentially, and it was so unmanageable. Contractors were really cautious of tendering, but also even fixed price contracts. And it was terribly difficult. And I think we're still coming off the back of that, and there's an awful lot more caution out there. So yes, occasionally you get recommendations from a contractor. I think our general stance and my general stance still is that you should tender and you should have competitive prices from 3 contractors, ideally, at least. I don't like them to have too many, but even if there's a contractor on the table from the beginning, my recommendation to the client, whether or not they choose to take that, would be still to competitively tender it.
Yeah, I agree completely. I do that on every project, regardless of where the project comes from. Marissa, what do you think about that?
I would say the same. Like I said, I do have relationships with several contractors in the area, and I usually do get referrals for projects from them. But for the most part, when I finish a set of documents and I'm talking with the client, I often advise them to get at least 3 prices, just so they know what the range is out there. Someone might come in very high and someone might come in extremely low. And I usually advise them, you know, this person is going to be in your home for several months. It's someone you want to trust, and you want to know that they do good work. You don't want to just hire Joe Schmo off the street because he had the lowest price. You want someone with experience. So I always advise clients, you know, get 3 prices, make sure that you can see work that the contractors have done before, make sure they have a website. Some contractors will say, hey, come see this project that I recently built, because you want to see their workmanship. When I recommend people, I trust them. I wouldn't recommend a contractor who I know does shoddy work. I know I only recommend people that I know I have established a relationship with and that I trust.
Okay. All right. We have another question. This is from Jeremiah Russell. I'm going to read the question. In terms of practice responsibility, and I think this was touched on quickly, what is the critical difference to be aware of for architects who are interested in practicing both in the US and the UK? Licensure, contract, certifications, ? Also, I work in historic preservation. What should I know about that practice in the UK? Alex, you do historic preservation work in your practice?
I was going to suggest that Scott would probably be best placed to answer this, because he
All right.
A, works with historic preservation, and B, understands the US and the UK
Yeah.
implications.
Thanks, Alex. So interesting that, because you know, I'm from the States, and I keep wondering, you know, should I take advantage of the reciprocity and get, you know, qualified,
You
you know, in
should.
the States here? But well, you say that, and then I'm like, well, if I had a project in the States, Bill, you know, I'd do a job with you or something, you know. So,
Okay.
but so so is it worth it? But in terms of historic buildings, I think the sensitivities involved are the same, you know, and again, or the process of an architect's work is the same. You know, you have a client, you have a opportunity with the building, and you do something with that. You create an intervention or something that's you know, more in keeping with the building. So the approaches are the same. So in terms of historic buildings and dealing with them, the approaches are the same. And the problem we have here is that we deal with the local authorities and what we call the planning and conservation officers. And because they're so short on resources now, you can't have those initial face-to-face discussions with them with some tracing paper, and you have just, you know, what are we going to do here? You know, what would you agree to? It's very difficult. So we have to go about it in a very circuitous way, and it can become you know, quite adversarial. You know, you put forward a proposal, they say no, you change it, they say no again, and you don't have a constructive dialogue, which I think is a shame. So I would say the best way to approach these things, either from, you know, a design perspective or list of buildings or anything you're doing, is to try to build those constructive, trusted conversations with, you know, your colleagues on the other side of the table, you know, in the local authorities. I think that's quite important. And, you know, and then I think the difference is, you know, from what I've seen in terms of historic work in the States and historic work here, is here it's much more, you have to keep it, you know, you have to keep it, you have to, you know, cut that piece of wood and splice something else in, and, you know, make sure it's the same kind of wood. Whereas I think in America, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, it's more, well, you can replace it if it's like for like, and they're not so hell-bent on keeping all the original building fabric.
It depends. It depends.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, yeah.
what if a US architect wanted to take on a project in the UK, if it was historic preservation based, that might not be so easy because the process you describe is a lot of face-to-face and interaction back and forth with the authorities that have jurisdiction over protecting those historic assets. And of course, listen, a lot of respect for Europe and for the UK. You have over 1,000 years of historical buildings to protect in many cases. And that's just amazing.
Matthew, but I mean, I'm working on a project, a grade two star listed building, but we found a Neolithic compression stone on site, a piece of flint that some ancient human used to make flint tools from. I mean, they're just lying around, these things, because they're quite easily found. So it's more than 1,000 years. No, I mean, built heritage. We've got kind of Stonehenge and other monuments like that go back even further. So in terms of human habitation, it goes back quite a long ways, and it's all layered throughout our built environment.
Right. So I can't propose an addition to Stonehenge.
They've kind of done that, haven't they?
Well, yeah, I guess. Okay. You know what? I'm going back to the outline now. Copyright. How is copyright handled? I mean, I put a copyright statement on all of my documents. But people tend to ignore those copyright statements and make all kinds of copies. And now that we have electronic copies, sometimes you can't even tell the difference between the original and the copy. What happens in the UK? Alex, can you handle?
Well, I'll just quickly set the scene. So
Okay.
when an artist or anybody creates something and you publish it, it's yours. So but it's just the piece of paper. So that's what you own. So it's produced for a purpose, an application or whatever, and that's what it's good for. And people can't copy that unless they have your permission, and they have to use it for the purpose it was originally made for. So there's quite good protection potentially.
How is it enforced?
Well, if you have to be wary if someone's using it, and then you get a solicitor involved and you say you're using this the wrong way. But I think both Laura and Alex would be interesting to understand, because this goes further about, we make a building and then you rely on the images of that building to present your practice in the future. So I think it would be useful to hear, because I know we've touched on this before, and your guys' view on this, because it would be really good. So I don't know if Alex, why don't you start this one first, and then we'll.
Well, we come across this a lot when on the more commercial schemes where we're doing larger developments, we have quite often it'll be the case where we might get planning for a scheme, we might design it, and then a contractor might take that on and have their own design team. And we build Revit models of these proposals, and then another team might want to take this proposal on, and we have to come to an agreement where they can take our 3D models and take ownership of them. And quite often there'll be an expectation that they can just, they can have this model and all of our sort of intellectual property already, just, to take it on to deliver the model without a kind of written agreement. But that is obviously, it's in conflict of any copyright law. So yeah, we have conversations around that a lot. The photography one's very interesting because obviously, the photographer that takes the photos owns the copyright of those photos to start with, and whoever might instruct them. So we might employ a photographer, then they have to have a written agreement that we're able to use those photographs for our purposes, not just to have the photos, but then if we want to use them in magazines or anything, it's a very everything needs to be sort of agreed in writing, or otherwise you're at risk of having this sort of copyright issues. Laura, what's your view on that?
Anybody ever grab one of your documents and misuse it? That happened to you?
Yeah, it's happened.
Yeah, Would you go? I've never got to the point where we've instructed solicitors or anything, though. I don't know if you have, Laura, Scott.
No, not that far with copyright stuff. I mean, there's so many layers to this, as you've touched on. I mean, the biggest conversation that comes up often is the rights to the drawings. So we own the drawings, we own the design. They have a license to use those drawings on their site for that intended purpose. And I think that's consistent with you guys actually as well.
Yeah,
The bit that's complicated then is when they feel they have the right to the access to, in our case, DWGs and Alex's place of 3D model. And that's very contentious and very awkward and very difficult, because every client I've ever come across probably expects that that is the case, and it just isn't. And that's always a battle at the point if they, for example, if I mean, it happens in our private projects as well, Alex, that a client might not want to continue to pay for our level of service beyond planning, and there's somebody else that can do it cheaper, or a project manager that's got somebody that, whatever, tons and tons of examples of that, which was another subject. And then they want our drawings, and there's a fee usually associated with that, and we have a standardized letter that protects us, that once they're manipulated and used beyond, outside of, we issue a set of PDFs parallel to that is essentially our control document. Yes, there's that. The photographs, the extra thing that to layer up on what Alex was saying is absolutely right. Obviously, that the photographer owns the copyright to the photographs. We have fallen short, not deliberately, where the photos that we have a license to use have been published by a supplier or by a magazine. So a magazine would be fine as long as the photographer is mentioned, but we've fallen short where we've told them that this is the photographer and it needs to be in the magazine, but it's not, and they obviously the photographers get very upset about that. And the other one is where a supplier has used the photos without realizing they don't have the license to use them, and then obviously the photographer wants a separate fee from that supplier or the builder or the whoever that might be, kitchen person or the window company, or so the photographer continues to get an additional fee each time it's used by somebody else for their own advertising.
royalties.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Marissa, copyright. You've been burned? Anybody use your work without your knowledge?
Not me. My dad has had that experience though. I mean, like I said, my dad's been in practice for over 40 years, and there was a bank that he designed actually in town. And I think the owner ended up taking his drawings to another architect, and they ended up designing almost the exact same building. And I know there was a lawsuit for that. But me personally, I have not had that issue. I have had instances where clients ask for CAD files. I never issue CAD files to clients. If there is a consultant that requires my drawings, I'm happy to share it as long as they sign a waiver of release saying that they're not going to use it for any other purposes aside from this project. So I will share files with, engineers, interior designers, but I never tend to give my files directly to the client, just a PDF version of the drawings at the end.
How about you, Kim?
Yeah, really similar. It's interesting. One of the main questions I get when we first go into this with the contract is that question on ownership of drawings, because that is a clause in my contract that I own the drawings. And so that'll be a question that does come up. I think the computer has somewhat made that easier, because when we used to draw on vellum and Mylar, there was something tangible that they could hold. Now that it's in a computer program, I happen to work in a different computer program. I don't work in AutoCAD. So thankfully, it's somewhat easy to explain that, well, you wouldn't be able to open the file even if I gave it to you. And then we could discuss, if I give them PDFs, then, there's a sign off on that, they can only use it for certain things.
Yeah, like I said before, I have a copyright language on the edge of every one of my drawings. And I'm always keeping my eyes peeled, because I have had contractors try to reuse project drawings that I've done. And interesting enough, I get a lot of times I'll get a call from the from the building department.
Mm-hmm.
Well, your drawing showed up here, but you know, are you aware of this? Or they just want to make sure that I'm aware of it because something didn't look right. And that's happened more than a few times, which is also a problem. But you know, in working with consultants, I do you know, work with kitchen designers and some interior decorators, and then, you know, they're telling the client, oh, get the Revit model from the architect. I said, no, I'm not giving you a Revit model. You tell me what you want, and I'll produce a separate, you know, a vector-based diagram based on what you want. So if you're doing the kitchen, you don't need the whole project. You only need the kitchen. So I'll give them just the DWG converted out of the Revit of the kitchen. And when I release it to them, I release it to them with a whole list of terms and conditions that they are allowed to use it for the purposes of designing the kitchen, and that's it. That they're not allowed to use it for anything other than that. I also grant them a license to use it with an expiration date. So at the end of let's say a 6-month period from the date of this email, your permission to use this drawing expires, under which you either delete the drawing or cease to use it in any form. And these terms are binding on you or anyone you may pass this drawing to in the future. So I try to keep control of it that way. That usually takes care of it. I do have occasionally decorators, because the decorators, they hire computer people to, you know, they crack open the PDF and they try to harvest the vector data out of the PDF. And if I suspect that that's happening, what I will do is I said, sure, I'll share the PDF, and I scan it and I give them a, you know, pixelated PDF to use, and which they can use perfectly fine, but they can't crack it open and harvest the vector data. But you've got to constantly be on guard for someone who wants to take your work. And there's liability in that. If you give a client a Revit model, I mean, you know, we all use, there's all this, you know, we all use certain tolerances in our work. There might be a 1/2 inch difference. There might be an inch or even 2 inches in difference between the computer model and the actual finished building because of information you don't have. So, you know, you don't want to find that you get a notice of a lawsuit because, you know, your drawing shows, you know, 19 foot 2 inches and the builder built it at 19 foot 5 inches. And somehow it's your fault because the drawing shows it that way. And there isn't even a dimension line. They just happen to get a hold of the Revit model. So I'm very careful about releasing any digital information at all to others, including consultants. But that's just the way I try to keep on top of it. But it's getting more and more difficult because now we have municipalities, you know, that, you know, you're going for a zoning hearing. It's open to the public. They want to publish your drawings on their website so that the public can see them ahead of the hearing. That opens the door to a whole bunch of other problems.
So that's quite interesting, Bill, because here everything's public access. So when we submit, well, design work to local authorities for approval, it is public, it's in the public realm. So people can download that and take, you know, whatever they want from it in a sense. I mean, obviously there is copyright protection, but and the local authorities' websites themselves emphasize that these are all, you know, covered by copyright. You can download them for your information and, you know, to read the particular case, but you can't use them for anything else, kind of thing. But I guess it's like with the music industry, you know, just trying to control information is going to become even more of the big issue for us, you know, moving forward. So
yeah, it's an ongoing problem. It's been a problem forever since the first Xerox machine, right? I mean, people, you know, keeping copies and trading copies and offering to give people information to help them achieve something else that, you know, the work that you've prepared is being used, you know, without your permission. It's a terrible thing, but it's happening across all the arts. It's not just in architecture. It's just that there's a liability attached to it in some cases that we have to be very cautious about. All right, let's see. Do we have any more questions? Let's see. Jeremiah Russell would like to know if there are additional certifications to work on historic structures. Do you have additional testing or additional certifications in the UK?
Yeah, you don't need them, but obviously it helps if you want to pursue the work. So there are accreditations and other organizations related to the architectural profession to do with historic buildings and conservation. So yeah, there are quite a few, and they're different, and depending on what you're interested in and how you want to present yourself, you would choose an appropriate organization. So, I mean, the RIBA itself has a conservation architect kind of thing, you know, but I mean, I'm not any of those things because I feel I've been doing it for so long. If you want somebody with some more initials after your name, then you can have them. But you know, I'm perfectly capable.
You absolutely are. Just tell them to call me. I'll give you a glowing review. All right. Back to our outline. I don't know. Where do you want to go from here, Scott? It's your world.
So, well, we haven't really touched on energy and sustainability issues, which I think are becoming much more of an important thing for all of us, and how that's handled. So that might be a good topic to springboard from this point.
Okay. Where do you want to start? Pick a box.
Why don't we start on your side, and then we'll kind of
okay. Why don't we
move it back to the UK.
Marissa, you didn't have your hand up, so I'm going to go to you.
Okay. Well, so I feel now with the new energy code, I am finding myself educating the client a lot more on what's required, especially with new builds. You know, the level of insulation that's required, the blower door tests, things like that. So with the newer building code, I feel like we're kind of being pushed in the direction of having to do it on most projects. I've really only had a few clients that have reached out to me ahead of time and said, I specifically want to build something green or passive house. I would say the majority of my clients have no idea, and I'm the one educating them. And now in some cases, I find myself educating the builder, especially with the new code and the levels of insulation required, and how the wall types are going together. So it's definitely a learning process. And I don't know, that's all I have to say right now.
Yeah, it's funny, but I actually had a building inspector ask me to walk through with him on his inspection, and he wanted to learn from me all of the sustainable aspects that were incorporated into the building, and he wanted me to show it to him because he wanted to learn how to inspect it, which I took that as a great compliment. I was like, he's coming to me to teach him how to inspect what I've designed. So that's interesting. How is that handled? Laura, energy efficiency, the code upgrades, climate change, it's all a huge issue in Europe. How does it handle in your practice?
So we've had an overhaul of Part L of our building regulations recently, and it's so now the U values that we need to achieve and the amounts of insulation have greatly increased both in refurb projects and in new build. Air tightness, which you guys have probably been doing better from building with timber so much anyway, and vapor barriers and things before, but in the UK, building a lot with cavity walls, our air tightness is definitely under scrutiny a bit more, and even within existing buildings I think there's a much bigger drive now to improve air tightness. But with that of course comes vapor control and how we ventilate the buildings. So suddenly there's a massive increase now on the size of trickle vents and background ventilation that you need to have in the buildings. On new builds now there's something called psi calculations. Sorry if I'm preaching and you already know this, but that's now to do with coal bridging. So there are standardized details, which worries me. There's a lot of, with the type of work I do anyway, there's a lot of standardized details that come with pre-calculated energy calculations, basically on how much coal bridging there is. And if you want to do your own details, there's a fee for every detail that they have to do their own calculations on, to the tune of about £400 a detail. So that suddenly becomes quite a big client risk if you're designing a bespoke building with lots of steel and cantilevers and glass and things. So that's been quite a hot topic in our office and still remains such. I hope it won't affect the way we design, but it probably will have a bit of an impact on that and standardising some things. The other bit that's really interesting, and this has just happened recently and continues to happen, which is really quite devastating, is there is definitely an interest and a drive for our clients to use renewables now. It's becoming more normalised to have air source heat pumps, certainly, and photovoltaics. What's really frustrating is that it's still, the payback on it is still so poor that when we have specialist consultants running all the figures for them, and we've got a consultant that does a sort of 20-year payback scheme on all the different ways they can heat their house and generate the electricity. Unless a house is on oil, it rarely stacks up to come off gas, and I find that really devastating. And even though the clients genuinely wants to come off gas, and there are incentives from the government to do that and grants available to do that, it still doesn't equal out over a 20-year payback currently on the gas prices. And so it's hard, honestly, economically, for clients to make that decision to pull away from gas completely, which is annoying.
So you're using.
They always want to do it, and then they find out the cost, and then
Right.
and the worst thing is we and over here you do your design, and a lot of that entails putting solar panels on the roof and design and that kind of thing. And then just what I wanted to get back to is Marissa, you mentioned passive house before. And so I think, Alex, I don't know if you've done passive house here yet, but it might be worthwhile touching on how the justification and inspection process works and the costs therein. Do you have a insight into that?
Yeah. I do, yeah. We, myself and my colleague Rachel, are certified passive house designers, so we've gone through the passive house course, which is quite intense, with a view of trying to build more passive house developments within the UK. The reality is, when you get to looking at the cost of construction and the cost of the certification, that a lot of domestic clients they'll have these ambitions to build a passive house and hugely well insulated and massively airtight, but then when it gets to the point of actually certifying it and paying somewhere in the region of about £10,000 to get the plaque on the wall that says this is a passive house, that puts them off. And so what we end up doing really is sort of designing to passive house principles, and we'll make this building as airtight as we can and as well performing thermally as we can, but then not actually certified and not go all the way to passive house standards. So I mean, it's a positive in that we are trying to reduce the carbon emissions from development through passive house, and next to no heating costs these houses have. But yeah, the certification process is questionable.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we have similar situations here. I mean, I designed a LEED Platinum building, which was registered and certified, and the additional cost of the inspections and the green radar and everything that needs to be done is rather a problem. So I have clients approach me and say, well, I want everything that was in the LEED house, but I don't want to go through LEED. So I want the house, but I don't want to pay for the certification, because I don't see any value in the certification. So that's definitely a problem over here too. Passive house is something that really intrigues me. I wish we could do more of that, because that, I think, is really ultimately the future. We can get that right. But the users who live in these buildings are often an obstacle because they don't know how to use the house. it's, you know, they live in it and then they try to turn the heat up or turn the heat down and they end up, you know, messing it up in some way. Kim, in terms of energy, in energy calculations and energy conservation in your work, what do you see?
I think it's kind of similar to some of the things Marissa was saying. You know, energy codes are really kind of dictating what the clients actually will do because of the cost. Before we were looking at it and it would come back and you wouldn't get the ROI and the return, so the clients wouldn't do it. I mean, solar, we've been looking at solar for years, and normally it would be eliminated from the project due to cost.
Right.
Now, because of some of the changes, I'll say that we're seeing more solar. The insulation is going higher. We're doing more blown-in insulation because it gets you the greater R values that you need to get the energy calculations to meet the code. More efficient mechanical systems, but again, they're being driven by the codes that are forcing it more than the clients and the contractors wanting to install them.
Yeah, I get a lot of resistance from contractors. So, oh, you put continuous insulation on the outside of this. You know, I'm just going to do it the way I always do it. I said, oh,
I definitely got that on a new build recently. I'm like,
Yeah.
that's not what the drawings say.
Right. I said, you know, you don't have a choice. This is what the code requires now. You can't do it without a continuous layer. Oh,
And I
well,
think
the inspector's not actually going to look for that anyway, so it doesn't really matter.
And you do
There's
love
a-
it when the inspectors do look at it and then they come back to you
That's
and they have
right.
to admit that they were wrong.
Right.
And it's interesting that our industries are you know, bodies like AI, I don't know how they do it, RIBA, they're always saying, oh, the architects have all this power, they can change the world. Well, at the end of the day, it's only through legislation to making people build energy efficiently and be responsible that we're going to get anywhere. Because as we've just, by example, shown that, you know, our clients, when faced with a cost decision, will probably go for the lesser cost option because they'd rather spend their money on a new kitchen,
Right.
car, holiday, something else that enhances their life more than a more energy efficient house.
Right. I mean, it's a classic, you know, economic decision. I mean, you've got initial cost versus life cycle cost. Very often the client will go for reducing the initial cost regardless of the life cycle cost because, you know, it's here and now, and 10 years from now, who knows where I'm going to be living? You know, there's no self-regulating mechanism by which for them to choose what's best for everyone. They choose what's best for themselves. And I totally understand that. But I mean, I do have some success stories. I mean, a client recently, in fact, yesterday, was complaining that his energy usage had gone up from before the construction to now. And I said, okay, so well, how much? And he's like, oh, you know, it went up about 3%. And I said, okay, but your house is now 3 times the size it was when we started. And you only had a 3% increase in your energy usage. And he looked at me and he goes, yeah, you're right. I said, your house is performing exceptionally right now. And he's like, oh yeah, I never thought of it that way. You know, so sometimes it has to be explained in brutal detail before people get it. But I do think that as a profession, you know, where you are in the UK and where we are in the US, I do think we are having an impact. We are making a difference. And I do have clients that do understand the ROI and they do want the upgrades. They're willing to pay for the upgrades now in order to save in the long term. They also believe, and I agree, that these systems and these higher levels of efficiency and insulation, regardless of the code, are going to make their properties, their real estate, more valuable on a resale in the future. I believe that will start to have an impact. But I mean, everything is demand driven, and because we can't make more surface of the earth, it's a limited supply, it's a limited resource. You know, real estate is going to continue to go up in value. Construction costs are going to continue to go up. But the best thing that we can do is be a fantastic resource to educate the clients so that they can make the decisions that they feel are in their own best interest.
Yeah, but you have to have the right ground. You have to have the right, kind of soil to plant that in a sense. So I think one of the other things we have on our list, Bill, is about the difference between the kind of the context and setting in which we work in the States or here. And yes, we've got this very urban environment or rural environment, basically, whereas in the States, we've got these sprawling suburban kind of setting. So, and what I think on the same topic, really, when you have a strong kind of urban setting, and you have to concentrate on the way people live closer together. So then, therefore, there's more legislation, for instance, through the planning legislation that actually helps us do our job, because it says you have to pay attention to this when you're designing something in an environment where it's going to affect more than just the people who are going to use that building. And I think that's really important to note.
Can I make a point on that, Scott? Talking about urban developments and I'm talking specifically about London now, and with the energy efficiency. So we've got obviously building regulations and energy strategies for new build developments that are making us have to really well performing developments, really well insulated and really airtight. We've also got daylight and sunlight requirements. So you've got to get minimum daylight levels into these units. So you need quite big windows to achieve the daylight levels into these habitable rooms. And we also have Part O of the building regulations, which is to avoid overheating within these dwellings. So we've got pretty much conflicting building regulations, and we've got two developments now in London where we've made them incredibly energy efficient to comply with one part of the building regulations. We've achieved the daylight standards, but the only way of achieving the overheating is to introduce active cooling, i.e. air conditioning. So the government's entire sort of structure of the regulations are conflicting to a point where we're no longer passively ventilating these properties.
Right.
It's quite a new thing that we're going through, but it's absolutely madness, and we're trying to unpick that now.
Yeah, I think the overheating calculations, so that's for new builds, and we've started doing it on some of our larger refurbishments and extensions, offering it to the client as an option. But it's quite interesting because the data that we're getting back is not actually always as you expect it to be. Sometimes it's like a random dressing room with a west-facing window or something that's overheating and the rest of the house is okay. But I think that's going to be a real steep learning curve for us, and how we accommodate that, and how we passively ventilate, like you say, Alex, because we used to just open the windows.
Yeah. But now also we have noise assessments. So if you're in a London environment next to a busy road, you're not allowed to open the windows. So
and then there's fire escape, and then
there's architecture, there's design opportunities too, aren't there? In terms of sun shading, how you position the window, how you create the window opening to screen or protect the window from too much solar gain. And that in itself could be a design challenge that can work to, our advantage as designers in order to, create almost a new vocabulary for buildings in a way, because of these things.
Yeah.
The complexity of what you need to know to practice architecture now is really significant. I mean, there's just so much. There's no possible way that a student could learn all this, going to college and getting a degree. I mean, you need to learn all of this after by engaging in practice and dealing with the regulations and trying to implement them and seeing what works. What I see as a problem is when all of the requirements of the regulations don't necessarily produce the intended result. You have unintended consequences because, as Alex said, you have interaction between different regulations that are in conflict with each other. That's very frustrating. That's very frustrating.
It's when you're reduced to, relative sizes and proximity of spaces. It's like, it's not really design. It's just arranging your squares together in a way that, is functional.
Right.
But I mean, on your side of the ocean. That's quite interesting to understand how one kind of deals with those, in a sense, potential design opportunities moving forward. I mean, you guys find that challenge, something that you relish? I mean, Alex is fighting with it at the moment, but I know them, and I think that you'll get over it. But what about the US contingent? How are you guys deal with these? I suppose the question I'm trying to ask actually is, it's about how do you? It's about being a good generalist. You have to be a good generalist and a good manager of all these conflicting issues.
Right. What do you think, Kim?
Yes, definitely, especially with more regulation, you find sometimes things are fighting each other, but each project has its own individual priorities, its own individual owners, its own individual, town regulations. So you just have to deal with it case by case. And that's actually sometimes frustrating, but fun in the challenge of, finding the best way to fit it together to make the best end result for the project.
Yeah. I have I'm licensed as an architect and as a community planner, but I also have an additional license as a building inspector and a construction official. I went through the government training. So I get all of the advance notice on all the code changes that are coming, because they're notifying the inspectors that they're going to have to start inspecting for some of this stuff. So when I get those notifications, I go back and assess some of the most recent projects I've done to see what I would have had to have done differently. And then I try to go out and educate not just the clients, but the contractors, because if they build it wrong and it comes in, the inspector decides one day that he's going to enforce, that could be a disaster for the contractor and the client. Oh, we have to rip it open and start over. It's just crazy. But
that's really interesting that you say that, Bill. I've had 2 projects that I designed previously, like years back, that the owner sat on the project for 2 years or whatever, and then the building code changed. So now the drawings that I submitted at that time are no longer compliant to the building code. So I've had to say to the client, look, I know that I designed this for you, but now all the codes have changed. We have to update the drawings so that when it goes to be built, you're going to pass inspection. Otherwise, these drawings are kind of useless, so that's, a whole new fate.
Clients get very frustrated.
Yeah.
More costs, more money. I'm paying you again to do something you did
exactly.
but because it was sat on the shelf too long, it's spoiled, and now you can't use it. So how about cost overruns? I mean, listen, we've got about 10 minutes or so. I don't see more questions. So, Scott, we had on our outline about, who's responsible for cost overruns. Can we touch on that a little bit?
The client is, of course, aren't they? No, well. So it's due diligence, isn't it? It's have you? Well, first of all, as the architect, have you provided everybody with enough information that they actually costed the exercise appropriately, and they're going to build it? But you never know. I mean, we've just had an example where we had a change of structural engineer, and a new structural engineer came in and decided to do a soil test. Now, that soil test suggested to them that perhaps the foundations that we've already poured for this quite large house weren't deep enough or wide enough, for that matter. It turns out everything was fine, but that could have been, like a major cost overrun as to what do you do with, how do you actually, fix this problem? Because you can't just pour more concrete next to the old foundations, it would be a major issue. So that would have been an interesting discussion to have with the client at the time. Although they also changed the brief, so they added more mass to the building, which also added to the problem in terms of how we were building the floors in the building. So, it's again due diligence, keeping on top of what's going on. making sure, you know, your contractor is informing you of the steps, or the client's contractor is informing you at each step of the way. What about you guys? Laura, what's your experience with this?
Any cost overrun issues?
Always.
Always.
So I guess it depends where you start the cost from, whether that's a contract where it's quite obviously locked in. I think the hardest thing to manage is everyone's expectations on what that tender price is coming in at, and it's very difficult to manage. It's a constant. I'm sure I would have spoken to you at some point about it, Scott. It's very difficult to align brief with budget. It's very difficult to advise on that, because in reality we're not cost consultants, we're not QSs, and we only have the data we have and our experience that we have in the office on previous tenders that have come in. So you can only give, you know, outline square meter rates on what previous projects have cost, but by the time you're speaking to a new client and you're talking about a project that's almost finished on site, it's wildly out of date already, especially in the current climate. So it's full of lots of caveats, if I'm totally honest, when we're giving any kind of square meter cost advice. So then there's the kind of due diligence of saying we really do recommend and we advise that you speak to a cost consultant and get a budget price, either pre-planning or post-planning, before we start the technical drawings, and make sure that your budget and your brief align. And then there's all sorts of different clients that react to that differently. There's the very risk-averse clients that want to absolutely know it's going to be, and they obviously have a finite amount of money. And then there's the wealthier clients who maybe don't have a finite amount of money, but they still don't want to spend more than what the end value of the property is going to be. And they still never align either. So even when someone says, no, I want the brief, it still never really is that in reality when you get to the end line. And then of course there's value engineering once you come into through tender. So I think cost management and cost overrun is really hard through the design stages, and matching client expectations
The
is
Wild
hard.
West, isn't it? Really?
Yeah.
I mean, it's you know, and then Alex, I don't know, in terms of, so you might try to convince the client that you do all the design work up front, even though you know they're going to change things down the line, as they do as clients normally. Things change. However, you do all the work up front, and you design it, and the contractor prices it, and then you still find in the end when he goes to execute it, there's some disparity. I don't know, Alex, have you what's your experience in that way?
Almost every time. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's unfortunately, it's the nature of construction, and you just fixed prices seem to be a bit of a thing of the past. I mean, contractors will tell you that they'll give a fixed price for a build, but then, you know, if the cost of steel shoots up or something, cost of labor shoots up during the construction phase, no contractor really, I know, is going to swallow that. They're going to go to the client and say, sorry, but you know, it's cost this. And you sometimes can reach an agreement on it, or sometimes you know, a client might be understanding of it and they might pay the contractor. Other times there might be a dispute over it. But I think Laura's point was a good one. We very much limit ourselves, and our professional responsibility is we're designers, we're architects, we're not cost consultants, we're not QSs, and we don't pretend to be, really. We'll high-end, finger in the air, square meterage rates is as far as our cost advice will go. And any architect who sort of, you know, I would tread very carefully about giving too much advice on how much things are going to cost, because inevitably it's going to cost more than any builder or contractor or QS will tell you.
It always seems to cost more. Kim, what are you seeing in your end?
Yeah, unfortunately, you know, I think it was brought up before and something that was said, and we're in the post-COVID world, and the whole, you know, costs changed so much during that time, and it still hasn't settled back down. So, you know, often it's, again, go to 3 contractors. I agree with the, you know, 3 contractors, get competitive bids, because they all use different suppliers. They all, you know, use different tradespeople. So I've had jobs where when they go out and look at it, it's the swing of the cost of the job between one contractor to the other contractor, and you never understand how it can happen, but it can. And I often recommend to my clients that we do a phase before we get finished with, construction drawings and we're ready to submit for permit. We really have that estimate done to make sure we're still in line with their budget, what they want to do. Do we need to make any changes in anything to bring it back down to their budget? Because I don't hazard guess on estimates anymore. The only thing we do is a per square foot cost. And I say that's based on, what the general information is right now, but that varies so much. So in those discussions with clients, I tell them we have to look at a range until we get contractors in to get realistic prices.
Kim, what is that range, just out of interest, in the US compared to the UK? Just at very high level, what?
It ranges from parts of the US too, and even in different parts of New Jersey.
Parts of New Jersey, exactly. I mean,
Regional.
yeah,
Okay.
down here in the Philadelphia suburbs, we kind of are somewhere between, for custom residential, $125 a square foot to $300 a square foot, and that really,
It's a huge range.
yeah,
Huge range. Yeah.
Yeah, in my part of the of New Jersey, which is directly outside of New York City, $300 a square foot is the normal. And then you have to throw on top of that the cost of putting the kitchen in, because that's a variable.
oh yeah, that's not included.
Bathrooms, those are big variables. They want imported Italian tile. I mean, this is there's big ranges. But I track this stuff myself in my practice, and I can usually give clients a fairly intelligent answer. If they're asking me about where they're headed cost-wise, it's still a range until we get the final bids in. But I can usually guide them pretty carefully right through to the end. And of course, we have to make adjustments as we go. But I don't know how that translates into pounds per square meter.
Well, 300
3,000
pounds a square,
pounds per meter.
$300, 300 pounds a square foot. So whatever the exchange rate is, I mean, it's difficult, but yeah, 3,000 pounds a square meter. So,
The way
it's kind of comparable, maybe a little bit more expensive.
Yeah. Okay. So you're seeing in excess of $3,000 per square meter.
Yeah.
Okay.
Three and a half would be a minimum. I
3.5,
would-
yeah.
You know what? That actually correlates pretty closely to the $300 per square foot, because you got the
Yeah,
2.8
yeah.
square per square meter. So that's about a 10-to-1. So yeah, about 3,500 per square meter. That seems to correlate.
Yeah. The only thing I would raise is that we tend to recommend that clients do a negotiated contract with a contractor. So there's no qualms about doing that here, because what you get is you get a contractor who's engaged, who wants to look to obviously do the job and then get the right price and make sure that he's building what the client wants. Instead of, you go to 3 contractors, and I go to 6 normally, and I end up with 2 valid prices in the end, because everybody else drops out, or they say they're too busy, or whatever happens, right? So it's a tough place. So again, we talked about our trusted consultants and colleagues, and I think in the same way, and you have to be careful not to get too close to any one contractor, because some of us get work from contractors too. But it's kind of a good way to go on some projects.
All right, I think we're coming to the end. We got less than 2 minutes left. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to thank our participants for listening. And of course, I want to thank our panelists, Kimberly Bunn, Marissa Iamello from the United States, New Jersey in particular, and our panelists from the UK, Laura Locke and Alex Giles. Thank you very much. And of course, my esteemed lifetime friend, Scott Masker. And I think that this concludes the program. It's AI New Jersey's Across the Pond, a candid conversation on small firm business practice, UK and US. We are going to take this recorded program and produce a YouTube video. I will let everyone know when that happens. And I want to thank PSI for setting up the Zoom. Megan, are you still there?
Still here?
Yes, okay, I think we're concluding the program now. Thank you very much, and I hope to talk with each of you at some point in the near future. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Yeah.
Bye now.
Yeah.
Bye.